So what is it about the dietetics program that seems to be, at least the way they teach you, anti-protein?
You know,
And I'll let you guys take it away.
if I had to guess, I really think that it comes from like a couple different things. I think the one, and you recently shared a paper about like the renal failure and protein intake, but they really harp on, at least in the medical nutrition therapy side of things, when we take we took 2 to 3 semesters of that, really kind of jump in on that it's bad for the kidneys. And because you do have at least prescribed is a restricted protein diet unless you have some other stuff going on with your kidneys. So I think that's one of the places that is the source of why they like slam protein. I think another one, and once again, this is more correlation than causation, but they do that lots of red meat is associated with poor cardiovascular outcomes. And people just kind of automatically associate red meat with protein. I think they fail to mention that we're not talking about like a filet. We're talking about like salami, hot dogs. We're talking about like the processed red meat, which is normally correlated with poor cardiovascular outcomes. And I think those are the 2, at least in my opinion, main sources of why they slam protein so badly. And then of course, there's the whole bad for your bones because somehow it pulls the calcium out, which is supposed to buffer the, acidity from I just think it's the old archaic way of thinking. And listen, we can use eggs as an example. 1 minute they're really cool, and 1 minute everyone's slamming them again. Once again, now they're back into the news as being good for you. I think for whatever reason, dietetics is slow sometimes to catch up with the changes in the science and in the available research.
I think you nailed it, but I think it really comes back to what we're taught. And I think it lacks current updated research. And, I don't know if Cassie, you had to, but I wrote a paper when we were in the program, and I used the ISSN stance on protein recommended allowance. And I used that in my paper, and I remember getting in trouble. I got like chastised for it because they were like, well, where's your reference? And I was like, it's right there. It's from the ISSN. And they're like, well, that's not the protein recommendation that we use. We use the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And I said, yeah, but if you look at the current literature, that actually needs to be updated. So Cassie's point is valid, but also they just need to be more updated on the research. It's slow.
Now, okay, updated. But we're talking the last 40 years. So
if you look at somebody very wise said to me when I was doing the master's program at Nova that it's a professional program and it's not the same per se as getting a master's. Somebody wise being on this call. And I didn't understand what
it's a professional degree, not an academic one.
Yes. And I didn't understand that because as an undergrad, it didn't really make sense to me at the time, but I understood that as I went through the program, because with at least the way that dietetics works is you have to go to an ISSN accredited college. So your degree has to be from ISSN accredited, and you are forced to meet, and not in a bad way, but you're forced to meet these competencies that prepare you to be a dietitian. And historically, dietitians have been in hospitals or clinical settings, right? So they're not really a focus on what's the latest research, how to, break down the research, how to read the available literature, what are considered reputable sources, what to do with, some of these recommendations that differ from like with the changing, available literature that's out there now. And so I don't know why they're slow to catch up, but yeah, they haven't really changed their model in terms of having it be so clinically focused. It's still very much like that. They do have a future model now, which is slightly different, but still in my experience, and I think Katie can attest to the same thing, it's still very clinical in their approach. It's all about my plate, health, and, what you're going to do to improve somebody through nutrition counseling.
Yeah.
Now, Katie, you said you wrote a paper on protein and you used the position paper as a reference. Was there a criticism of the reference per se? Like, was there a scientific criticism of the reference per se? Let's say that.
No, but it was more of we're supposed to be using certain materials that have been recommended and approved. again, talking about black sheep, I think Cassie and I fill that role pretty greatly in the program going through together, which is why we bonded, is because,
Good.
not everything you're given when you're in an academic setting is correct. And I think what's important, and something I teach other students too, is you should always approach things with skepticism, what am I trying to speculation. And like when you read something, you should go, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like
Skepticism.
Thank you. I'm dyslexic, by the way. So
you're not alone, right? Me too, Katie. So
are you? My daughter is too. It's so frustrating. But so when you read something, you should always think of, is this correct? And can I find something else to validate it? And that's kind of how my role has been in research, is I need to see it repeated over and over again to know that it's valid. And just because it's in one textbook written in Texas or Florida, depending, because that's where most textbooks are written, or California, they're biased and they're outdated. And so even though we had this approved group of textbooks that we were supposed to use, Cassie and I had wonderful mentors outside of the program, wink, wink, and were able to steer us in the right direction and teach us to, think outside of what we're being taught. So I think I really hone in on telling other students to do that. And I encourage them to do that. And when I use that reference, it wasn't like they were against it per se, but they kind of try to steer me back into that. Use the textbook only and use these references only. I still left it, but.
I mean, I found the textbook, one of the medical nutrition therapy textbooks I found was really funny, because in one paragraph, it did say that in the textbook, this to me is just crazy, but in the textbook, it did say that too much protein could be detrimental for bone metabolism and bone health. And then literally like 3 paragraphs later, it talks about how protein malnutrition interferes with bone metabolism, and not enough protein is bad for your bones. And I just thought that's such a weird thing to contradict yourself twice in the same chapter, like, let alone pretty much on the same page, so like. And I definitely think that, back to Katie probably can speak to the same thing, because I didn't pass the dietetics exam the first time that I took it. And it's the way you study for the dietetic exam is very different than I think the knowledge that's available out there, because I would get these questions that, to me, like, I'm like, well, this would be the more current answer. And I would get it wrong, because you have to answer it in the way that the academy is teaching you.
Yeah.
And like I said, with these test questions, and I think recently now they've started updating the test itself, but the test itself hadn't been updated in quite some time. So I'm answering questions based on like what the academy is teaching me, even though the literature is showing that like this might not be the best answer, or, this might not be the best way to treat something. Also, that test in general is really annoying, because it's going to ask you about diabetes in one question, and then the next question is going to ask you the proper pour ratio for pancake batter.
Wait,
seriously.
Really? That kind of question?
It was the most bizarre, and I failed it the first time too. I failed by 1 point.
Same.
And I remember being so angry, because it's like giving you a patient with 7 different diagnoses, and you got to do a tube feed. And I mean, this whole calculation of, I became a mathematician through this phase. And then all of a sudden it was like, what scoop number and how many scoops do you need to make a meal for 150 people at a cafeteria? And I'm just like, what?
Or there's a question that's like, you bake a cake and there's tunnels in it. What ingredient did you not have enough of or too much of? And I'm like, you go from like baking science to food science, or like to food service, I should say, to like medical nutrition therapy.
What's a tunnel in a cake?
It like funnels down. So I
Okay,
think
all
that's,
right.
is that too much sugar? I don't remember.
Yeah, all right. Well, all right. I see the relationship between tunnels and cakes and diabetes, though. There's some data on that too. Wow, those are real questions.
Yes. So studying was, Katie, well, we know that Katie's super organized. She definitely helped me study. But like the second time around, somebody asked me, oh, like maybe you can help people that didn't pass the first time by sharing like what you did to pass the second time. And like, quite honestly, I couldn't tell you if I did anything different. I was just annoyed. And I went into that second test with the mindset that if I don't pass this time, I don't care. The RD is not that important to me.
We did the exact same thing. I was like, if I don't pass it the second time, forget it.